Okay.
Welcome to the Breaking Into Athletic Performance podcast. I'm your host, Christian Chofie, here with Ryan Smack, as always. This is episode 5, and we're doing another short little episode, and this one is on testing. So the first question we're going to answer is, why should you test? And the reason, there's many reasons. Number one, so you know that your program's working. That's the obvious one. 2 would be so the athletes know the program's working. And 3 would be so the athletes can compete once in a while if they're not getting that opportunity super often. Honestly, there's not a whole lot more than that. It's a very simple concept. We need to test to make sure our program's working, and we need to know our program's working. So if it's not, we can manipulate it. There's really nothing that complicated about testing. You can test. My suggestion would be to test at least twice a semester, probably 3 times. That's testing everything that you need to know about the sport. And then you can put mini assessments in whenever you get a chance. And really that's about it. So Ryan's going to talk about what we should be testing, and then we're going to jump into some other stuff.
Yeah. So like Christian said, the main reason you're going to test is to know that your program is working. So the things that we're going to test are the KPIs or key performance indicators that we would be trying to target with our program that would be important to our sport. Those things are going to be a range of different variables that would be, like your energy system specific tests. So if I have a glycolytic sport, I might want to do some sort of glycolytic conditioning test or repeat sprintability test. If I have an alactic sport, I might want to get their peak power or their alactic capacity number so that I know that those things are improving over the course of a semester, or in a college athlete's case, over the course of 4 years, so that they're better prepared for the demands of their sport. In addition to energy systems, you're obviously going to need to do some sort of strength test. That's going to, in most sports, probably be lower body strength, because obviously when you're sprinting, jumping, cutting, or even in football, if you're trying to block a defensive tackle, a lot of your power and your strength is going to need to come from your lower body. I personally will also do some upper body strength testing if I train upper body heavily. For example, if bench press is my main upper body strength movement, I want to test bench press so I know if my training program has improved upper body strength. If trap bar deadlift is my main lower body strength lift, I'm going to test that at least twice a semester so that I can point to my program and say, okay, this actually did improve our lower body strength and our main movement by an average of X percent across our team. I'm also going to want to test metrics that are a lot more transferable to sport performance, which might be things like speed, change of direction ability, or any sort of field test that correlates with those things if they're important in your sport. So if I train a defensive back for football, they need to have great acceleration. They probably need good top end speed so they can cover a go route that a wide receiver is running if they're taking off 50 yards down the field. And they need good change of direction ability. So I need to pick tests that assess those qualities in my athletes. And most of this information is going to come from a needs analysis that you're going to do at the beginning before you write your training program. You need to reverse engineer the demands of your sport, which is a popular term, and figure out what are the energy system qualities, what are the biomechanical qualities, the biomotor qualities that you need in order to excel in whatever sport they're playing. Some other tests that you might want to do that might be individual to athletes are anyone that had a previous injury. You might want to try to figure out some sort of asymmetry test with your athletic trainers and your sports medicine staff, so you know kind of where they are baseline versus, okay, if I get injured, on my right side, is there all of a sudden a bigger asymmetry in range of motion or strength, or depending on your resources, time to produce your maximum force or time to peak power, depending on what you can measure. Because those things might serve as ways to create a return to play training plan that will allow you to know, okay, the athlete used to be here pre-injury and they're at the post-injury point and they're at 90% of that. So maybe they're ready for this next step. But like I said, that's going to need to heavily involve the sports medicine staff because medical decisions is not really under the scope of practice of a strength and conditioning coach. Christian, do you have anything else that you would include in a general battery of tests without getting too specific into like what you actually do with your sports yet?
Yeah, one thing I would add is just that you want to pick assessments that you can compare to other data. So every assessment I pick, first I make sure, does it make sense for the sport? That's number one. And you can make up your own tests and they'll usually work, especially if you have data from your own athletes from whatever last year. But the best thing you can do is pick assessments that you can compare to athletes all across the country from all time periods. So for instance, I don't think the 40-yard dash is necessarily the best assessment for every sport, but I'm going to use it as a speed assessment for a lot of my teams because I can compare it to so many different athletes. And that's just a very, very useful tool to have in your bag. But that's all I got for that.
Yeah, that's a good point. To go along with that, I think something that's extremely useful with your point is going through research or data that's just out there in general for your sports. Like if you're training a basketball team, you probably want to know what they do at the NBA Combine because everyone who plays college basketball or high school basketball probably has aspirations of playing in the NBA. So you want to figure out what the top tier talent in the world is being tested on. And you probably are going to want to run those tests whether you agree with their ability to test what you're targeting or not. Just like you said, a 40 might not be the best speed test, but if I train a football team, I need to run the 40 so I can tell my guys where they're stacking up against the elite talent in the world. And we can use their comparisons with the elite level athletes that are out there to show, hey, we're getting us closer to these levels. This is where we want to be at if we're physically the best in the country because these are the best times at the combine, or this is the best 225 bench press repetition number at the combine. And at some point, if you're training your athletes the right way and they're excelling in sport, hopefully they do have a shot at fulfilling their dreams, and they're going to need to go through those tests and they're going to need to hopefully excel in those tests. So you need to know what the tests are, how to improve the numbers, and how to coach them through doing the test, because ultimately at some point everyone wants to be in a position where they're able to help athletes get to that point in their career. And if you are in that position, you need to know what you're doing in order to hopefully help them make money and help them get drafted or help their stock in whatever their endeavors are in their sport.
Yeah, that's a good point. Did you have anything else there? I have a little comment.
Oh, no. Yeah, jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's also on the other side of it, people sometimes try to compare their Division III soccer team to the U.S. women's national soccer team. And that's fine if you want to look at the numbers just to see. But your team, your Division III soccer team is never going to be the athletes that the U.S. women's national soccer team is. So you can't expect them to train like the national team is. And that's one thing I get more from sport coaches than from young strength coaches. It's the sport coaches think that, oh, the women's national team is running 25 miles a week, and on top of that, they're practicing and lifting and whatnot. Your athletes can't handle that stress. Maybe one or two of them can, but overall as a team, they're not going to be able to train like the women's national team. So it's okay to look at the comparisons, but I think what Ryan's mostly talking about is like his Division one or two high-level football players, maybe some Division III players too, that have a shot at playing in the NFL, maybe the XFL. Even if they don't have a shot, most of their assessments aren't going to put your athletes in danger because they're just anaerobic sprint tests and change of direction, stuff like that. So it's a little different. You just got to make sure that you're not necessarily taking what they're doing at that level and trying to implement it at your level, unless it makes perfect sense, which it usually does not. But that's what I got there. So
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah. No, yeah. Along with that, so Christian, you just mentioned the coach is going to want to see, the U.S. women's national team is able to do these tests to this degree of success. Let's try to get our team to do that. And the answer 100% is we are not the women's national team. But if your coach wants to see certain things tested, the tests that they're familiar with are probably going to be the tests that those high-level teams do. So just in a sense of speaking the same language as your coach and being able to show results in something that they are familiar with, it might be worth exploring those tests and trying to figure out, if you've been at a school for long enough, you can say, hey, our great athletes in these tests weren't the women's national team, but this might be the upper quartile of scores that we get. So let's try to push the middle of the pack up towards our upper tier scores based on our level with tests coaches know and the coaches are familiar with. So you're able to some extent justify your job, even though that shouldn't be what it's about. If they want to see certain things improve, you need to know how to communicate that they're improving to the coach. And sometimes those are the tests that they are familiar with. Similarly, our next topic would be interpreting results. I'm going to let you kind of take off and run with that, but obviously when you interpret results, you need to do it in a way that I understand as a strength coach and maybe in a different way that the athlete and the coach understand, so that they're not confused with all the jargon that we might use when we talk to each other. So Christian, do you have any comments on how you would interpret results and what you believe is important when you're doing that?
Yeah, I'll jump into that. One thing I just wanted to say with what to test is make sure you're not overlapping and testing two things that test the exact same outcome. So one example I have is for aerobic capabilities, if you're going to test like the beep test, whatever, the yo-yo, don't do a 12-minute run or a 1 mile test, because you're testing the same thing twice and you're just wasting time and energy of your athletes. So that's the last thing I had on there. We'll come back to that a little bit and we'll give some examples of what we test. But for interpreting results, the easiest thing for me is to use percent increase or percent decrease. So that's what, for me, I think most athletes and coaches are all going to be able to speak that language. And you have to tell them what is significant and what is insignificant, because they simply don't know. For example, if you're testing a 20-yard sprint and your time dropped by 0.3 seconds, that is a very significant increase in speed. So it's all relative to the test. If you're running 10 miles and you only dropped 0.3 seconds, that's very insignificant. And then the same, if in most strength tests, if you add 5 pounds, that's a pretty significant test if you're already a trained athlete. If you're untrained, that's probably not a big deal. So interpreting the results all has to do with the level of your athlete and what exactly you're testing. But if it's a time test, most of the time I'm using percent increase or percent decrease, because I think that's what makes the most sense to them. If you give them a raw number, they might think it's really good or it's really bad, and it might be exactly incorrect what they're thinking. So it's good to use terms that are almost independent of the actual units that you're using on the test. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely agree with that. Like you said, the coach is going to probably understand percent increase or percent decrease a lot more than a number, especially when they're not familiar with the common scores or the units or whatever the metric is that you're using for the test. Another way that I think is helpful for interpreting the results for your coaches is to try to find a way to visually represent the results. So that might be a bar graph that has maybe a standard deviation, like one standard deviation above and one standard deviation below. Just like there are in research articles. And a coach might not be familiar with that, but if the top of the bar graph represents the middle and that middle goes up, the coach is going to see that that went up. And then you can explain to them that if the middle went up and the standard deviations are smaller, so there's a smaller range of people who tested outside of the team average, that might be significant in terms of the majority of your team actually improving. Where if your average goes up and your standard deviation increases, your average might have gone up because of some really high outliers, and it might not have actually changed your team as a whole. You might have actually had lower standard deviation numbers where maybe people did not improve and they actually went backwards. So things like that are also things you need to look at. Another thing I think that is very important when you're testing is you need to look at the device that you're using to measure whatever you're measuring. So the easiest example is in a speed test. If I'm using timing gates that are extremely valid and reliable and accurate, and someone improves by 0.05 seconds, that might be a real improvement. But if I'm using a stopwatch and someone improves by 0.05 seconds, I might have just messed up the timing on one, two, or both occasions. So whenever possible, you need to try to use the most reliable and the most valid measurement tool that you can, so that when you interpret your results, you're actually interpreting a real change rather than a measurement error.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. I wasn't thinking of that in the moment. Another thing with visual, definitely graphs are a great tool to use. Also, just colors. So for each individual thing, you can label it with a different color. I've always learned to try to keep the colors light, because if not, you're going to really hurt people's eyes and confuse them. One thing I do is I actually develop an athlete ranking system, and I may or may not show this to the coach depending on the coach, because some can really abuse it. But for example, I take all of the things that I test and I put them in a document, an Excel document, and then I will rank them in each individual assessment. And then from there, all you got to do is add those numbers together and divide by how many athletes you are. You're just taking the average, really, and you can get their overall ranking for athletic performance. And I think that's pretty valuable for the athletes themselves, more so than the coaches necessarily, because you can show them where they stack up on the team, and if they are absolute garbage, it might light a fire under their ass. Or if they're at the top, hopefully if someone's close, it pushes them to stay at the top. So that's another something I use that it's not really involved in interpreting the results, but that's just something that I'll use to further increase my odds of the athlete's motivation.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think sharing the results with the athletes, whether you're sharing everyone's results with every athlete or just athlete A's results with athlete A, I think that goes a very, very long way in building trust and the fact that you know what you're doing and you're trying to help them improve, and buy-in a sense that everything we're doing is actually having a measurable effect. So even if they don't like doing it at the time, and waking up at 6 a.m. and coming to weights or arriving at the field for speed work or conditioning kind of sucks sometimes, it's doing something that's improving a metric that is important for their performance. And anyone who's competitive and truly cares about their performance in their sport is going to want to see that. And I think that will make most athletes on the team at least have an appreciation for all of the work that they're doing. something that I want to kind of touch on that we didn't necessarily plan, but I just thought of is the difference between testing and monitoring. Because when we're talking about testing, we are mostly discussing a planned assessment of trying to compare a previous best number or best time to a new best number or best time in order to measure the effect of a training cycle. But monitoring would be measuring the readiness of the athlete for a certain activity like practice or a game or a training session on any given day. And monitoring usually will involve tests that you might use for other purposes. But the whole point of them is not to say, oh, you improved this much, is to say, what are you looking like today versus your average or your baseline? So do you have any thoughts on what you would use for monitoring, or why you would use an athlete monitoring system, and why you think it's important or why you don't think it's important? Because we haven't talked about this, so I'm interested to hear your opinion.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think it's important. I think there's a lot of ways to go about it. Obviously, let's try to keep the GPS out of it for now, because I think most people understand, like, on the field anyway, that's the best way to monitor, in my opinion. So other than that, inside the weight room, there's, in my opinion, there's 3 ways. So one would be RPE, rating of perceived exertion. The original scale is 6 to 20, and that's based on heart rate. So that's not necessarily the best scale to use with athletes. They don't understand why it's 6 to 20, and it doesn't make sense if it's not a VO2 max test or something. So you usually use the 1 to 10 scale, and you can take it before and after the lift. If they have lift cards, you can just put it on there. They can write it down, and then you don't even need to put it in your computer if you don't want. You just take a look at it and see how they're doing. And you know the super soft athletes from the hard ones. You know who's gonna put a 9 on there every day and who's gonna put a 1 on there every day. But your average is probably the most accurate, and that's where you're looking at to see if their average is up at a 7 or an 8. They're probably getting pretty crushed, and their sport coach isn't going to back off, so you're going to need to back off. And then if they're down closer to 2, 3, 4, you might be able to ramp it up a little bit. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with being in that range sometimes. So letting them recover a little bit is always a good idea. Next one would be a vertical jump, and a lot of people use this one. So pretty much every day or every week of training, the athletes come in and they do 1 or 2 just vertical jumps on a jump mat and record those. And that data can be extrapolated to see, just like anything else, how they're feeling. So if their numbers are way down from the week before, you probably annihilated them last week, and you should back off quite a bit this week. And just the same as RPE, you can use both, and I recommend using 2 forms, a subjective and an objective form. So I guess I should get into that a little bit. Subjective would be the athlete's perception of themselves, and the objective would be the actual number that an athlete can produce. So I would suggest using one of each of those. And then the third method would be in the weight room, velocity-based training, but I personally would use wattage. If you have like a Tendo unit or something, I would just use wattage because it makes more sense to me, but not to everyone. So if you're lifting the same load, that definitely makes sense as last week. But if you're lifting different loads, it's a little tougher to determine whether or not you're actually fatigued or not, because as we know, some people are stronger at higher loads. And okay, let me explain that a little better. Some people can produce more power at higher loads than others can at those higher loads. And some people can produce higher power or higher wattage at those lower loads than others can. So that's what I mean by that. So if you're working up to 80% that week, for 1 rep, let's say, and you did the same last week, then you can compare. but that's something that I would just use as it comes. So I wouldn't really plan for that too much. That's just another tool you can use to take a look at when it presents itself.
Yeah, I think all those are really good points. Regardless of what monitoring tool you're going to use, I think the most important thing when you're monitoring is you need to be consistent. If you're getting numbers on let's say a vertical jump every time they walk in the weight room, then you're going to have numbers on high stress weeks in the weight room, high stress weeks in practice, and low stress weeks. So you can see how those numbers change. If I only do it, once every 3 weeks and it's never on the same day and it's never in the situation or in the same situation, I'm not going to know why it's going up or down. I'm not going to have any context behind any increases or decreases in their readiness that would make sense. Like if I'm doing a vertical jump test and the jumps are all lower across the board and they're not as ready for the training session, but I know the night before a baseball team played a 18-inning game and they got home at 3 a.m, there's nothing to worry about. The jumps are supposed to go down. But if I know the context behind everything that's going on and I'm consistent with my measuring or my monitoring and all the jumps go down, but we just came off a deload week, why is that happening? All of these monitoring variations and all of the trends that you see, the best thing that comes out of it, in my opinion, is it opens the door for a conversation. So like you said, you're going to know the athletes that constantly put 9s on their RPE score every single day. If they put a 7 on there or a 6, that's not a 2, so it's not a red flag. But if you know the athlete and they're always a 9 across the board, it's still lower compared to what they're usually at. And if they're lower 3 sessions in a row, it might be worth saying, hey, what's going on? Like your RPE would be higher. I misspoke if it's hard. Yeah, sorry. So in an RPE test or an RPE feedback, if it's higher than normal and it's always a 6 and they put a 9 and you don't agree with the fact that the training session should have been harder and everyone else doesn't see an increase in RPE, it's just that athlete, you might be able to have a conversation saying, hey, what's the problem? You're putting a higher RPE, you're having a harder time with the training sessions, and we're not seeing that with your teammates, and you're usually good. Is everything okay at home? Is something going on with your body? How have you been sleeping? How's school been going? And that just adds more information that you can use to make decisions in programming. Along with that, one thing that's very important when you're trying to monitor is you need to be consistent especially for an RPE, you need to be consistent in the time that you're doing the monitoring in. So if I'm going to get an RPE at the end of every single workout, you can't get an RPE 20 minutes after the workout ended when they're sitting on their butts and texting or goofing around and drinking a protein shake, and then the next do it immediately after they do a finisher. You need to be extremely consistent across the board so okay, this is your opinion of the workout stress immediately after the workout's over. Or every time I'm going to give you 10 minutes to recover so you can calm down and not have that last exercise or whatever we just finished fresh in your mind, and you can sit back and think of the training session as a whole. Or maybe you do an RPE for every single block of your program. I wouldn't necessarily do that because I think that's a little time consuming, but you have the option to do that if you stay consistent with what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any tests that you use, like monitoring tests that you specifically use?
Yeah. I mean, the ones I just talked about, I haven't used RPE and the jumps a whole lot, but I think I'm going to get more into that for sure. In terms of actual just testing, like twice a semester or whatever, one thing I try to make everything is I try to make it relative to body weight, because let's say, and people are always freak out about taking body weights, especially on female athletes, because they're afraid it's going to exacerbate eating disorders. But if the athletes know the reason you're doing it is so you can compare it to their physical assessments, they don't care. I mean, there might be that one rarity that gets upset about it, but most of the times I've had female athletes asking me if they could get their weight. And I was like, I mean, I'm not going to say no because I can use that data. So I use it for almost everything. So when I'm looking at a strength test, let's say max front squat, because that's what I test for strength, I will almost never take that raw number. I'll always use like pound for pound strength. So I'll do what percentage of their body weight can they lift. So let's say someone can lift, I don't know, one time their body weight squat. That's, or front squat, that is. That's an okay front squat, right? What's the number most people use? So at some point, strength stops contributing to speed. Once you get a certain strength level, I usually use 1.7 to 2.0 times your body weight for the back squat. So I never test the back squat. I just front squat, and then I multiply it by, I forget what the number is to multiply by to get your back squat, but that's what I do for that. I don't know what your take is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I think I saw Zach DeCont at TCU say that he specifically saw diminishing returns and speed qualities with a front squat that was above 1.4 times.
Yeah, so about the same.
Yeah. Once you do the conversion into a back squat, I'm sure it works out to be extremely similar.
Mm-hmm.
The body weight point is a great point. That's very easy to relate to strength testing, and I do the same thing. I think relative strength is the name of the game when it comes to most sports. Obviously, sport is usually about speed, acceleration, and agility in a team sport. And if you're getting really, really strong, but you're also getting really, really big and it's hurting your speed, what the heck is the point, right? So you want to increase relative strength so that you're able to hopefully move your body weight that is then a smaller relative percentage of your force capabilities at a faster rate. Something that's also important is body weight as it relates to a vertical jump test or a broad jump test or even a speed test, because if you're moving a higher body mass, the same displacement in a vertical jump test, a 200-pound vertical jump that's 35 inches is much more impressive than a 100-pound vertical jump that's 35 inches, because you need to overcome so much more inertia. So you need to produce much more power in order to achieve that number with a higher body weight.
Absolutely.
Along with that, you touched on female athletes having a hard time measuring their body weight. If you create some sort of routine where they're frequently measuring it and it no longer becomes like, oh, we're testing next week, that's the day I need to measure my body weight, there might not be such a mental component to it. Just to add to your point, that's something that I try to do with female teams. When I do want their body weight, I'll make it not a daily thing because I don't train them every day, but every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday when we come in the weight room, I'm going to take body weights. So it's so frequent that they hopefully will be discouraged from changing their eating habits around the time that they're required to take their body weight.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, you need to do your job. If that's part of your job, you do it. If there's an athlete that's struggling, you should have the skills to recognize that, and you refer them to mental health services at your school, because it's not your job to deal with it. But you can't have the fear of something like that get in the way of you doing your job to the best of your ability. Some people might tell you differently, but at the end of the day, I'm going to test I'm going to take the body weight of every single team I have because it gives me the best data to give them the best chance to perform in their sport optimally. So that's just simply what I'm going to do. Yeah. You actually said exactly what I was going to say with the jump test thing. So what I'll do, like the only sport I'll look at straight up vertical jump for is basketball or volleyball, because those are the only sport it matters for. So I'm going to use their vert and I'm going to take their body weight and I'm just going to calculate power off of that. And that's the opposite side of the spectrum where raw power does matter for a sport like baseball, softball. If you can produce more power, you can hit the ball a lot farther 9 times out of 10, unless your technique is absolute garbage. So I'm gonna look at the opposite side there on power, and I want that raw number. I don't want it as a percentage of body weight on that one. So just real quick, I'll list off all the things I test, and then you can list off yours, and we can talk about them quick, and then that'll be about time. So for strength, I'll test front squat and maybe bench. I think you need to do one upper body, one lower body test. For speed, I'll test, if I have the capability, I'll test a 40-yard, and I'll get their 20 or 10-yard splits off of that so I can get acceleration as well. If it's not possible, I'll just test one or the other. Some teams I test the 20. Others that might get up closer to top speed, I'll probably test the 40. For glycolytic assessments, which I almost never do, I personally like the 300-yard shuttle test. I don't necessarily like running 300-yard shuttles all day, but I think the test is accurate and it's valid, so I will use that. For aerobic endurance, I will look at the yo-yo beep test for multiple reasons. It might not be – it's possible to game, I guess, but if you do it like it's supposed to be run, it creates a competitive environment, and I like to see that next level attitude in athletes. So, it's an aerobic test. It measures what it's supposed to. So, and especially for soccer, pretty much everyone in the nation uses that test, so you can compare it to others. What else do I do? So I talked about the power. I do that. That's pretty much it. I don't measure like a hang clean because I already get power from my vertical jump. Yeah, I think that's it. Maybe you'll trigger something that I'm missing, but yeah. I think that's it.
Yeah, so I do more or less the same tests as you. I'm going to list them anyways. For lower body strength, in the past, I have done back squat. The school I work at Nova Southeastern, we recently got to the point where we have enough trap bars to where I believe I'm going to move into testing trap bar deadlift. But because of resources, I typically would test a back squat. That's one of my 2 major lower body lifts that I use. Problem with that is the depth usually isn't the same when you test. And you get deeper, they don't listen. That's why I move into a trap bar. Beside the point. I also test bench press. I will usually do a relative strength / strength endurance test with pull-ups or chin-ups, just because I like to have a number of how many pull-ups or chin-ups an athlete is able to do. The reason I say it might be strength endurance is I've had people do 35, which at that point, I don't really care if it's 35 or 40, but I just like to know relatively to their body weight what they're able to do with their upper back. So that's chin up.
Yep, that's another test I actually do that I forgot. So
yeah. For speed, I'll only try to get a 10 or a 20 if I have a laser timer. I usually won't do those with a hand timer because the time is so short that I think the error is going to create such a difference in such a short sprint that it's not worth doing.
I don't do any timing. Never.
Yeah. I currently don't have laser timers, so when I'm going to do a speed test, I'll typically do a 30 for softball or a 60 for baseball. For glycolytic tests, I typically won't do them. If I'm going to do them, I would actually agree that I would do a 300 just because I think you're able to find scores that are out there for 300-yard shuttles. But I personally don't believe that a glycolytic test is necessary unless you're, for example, training hockey. I'd probably do the Wingate test because they do that at the combine.
Yeah,
Don't train hockey. So my aerobic test would usually be the yo-yo beat test, just like you would do. There's tons of data that you can get from it. It tests your aerobic system just like you need it to. And then I'll always do a vertical jump test, just like you. I'll do it relative to their body weight, so I'll calculate vertical power. I'll usually do a broad jump just to get some sort of horizontal measurement. And I don't do this currently. I'm thinking of trying to implement not a true triple jump, but like a triple broad jump where it's 3 continuous broad jumps to try to get an elasticity comparison to their triple broad jump versus their single broad jump and how they relate to each other. I've heard very good things from other coaches about using that. I just need to find more information, but that's kind of an avenue that I'm exploring at the moment.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. That's cool. That's like, it's almost like doing a depth jump. Kind of not really, but
RSI. I also test RSI, so reactive strength index for whoever isn't super familiar with that. But yeah. Horizontal version of trying to get an RSI score.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I might look into that more. I mean, I wish more of us had force plates to do a vertical RSI, but
yeah,
we're not all rich. But
yeah, someday. I mean, there's like RSI mod tests you can do with, like, we have push bands, so that's one of the tests that's built in. I haven't run it yet because we just got our athletes back and we can't share equipment and they need to wear the band. But we're planning on using RSI mod as like a monitoring tool this year just because we have a lot more bands. So we'll probably have a conversation at some point and I'll let you know how that turns out. But
yeah, report back on that.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you want to add before we close it out?
I guess a change of direction test I would do is probably an L drill for football, but I don't do a whole lot of them for a couple of reasons. Your speed is going to be pretty well related to your change of direction. Often you're not going to have time or the space. Like in my environment, I very rarely am able to do a change of direction test on the day I want to test just because of availability of space. So I probably won't do it. And your eccentric strength and your isometric strength is also very well related to your change of direction ability. So there's ways you can guess. Obviously, if you can get the test in, that's optimal. But if not, there's ways you can get around it. And then sometime I don't want to get into it now, but we can talk about like change of direction deficit and stuff like that with your speed. But that's for another day. Let me just convince you real quick never to back squat your athletes again. So the reason I only front squat my athletes and myself really anymore, it's just one reason. So when the bar is loaded anteriorly, when you descend into your squat, your torso is more upright. And what that really means is that your center of mass is closer to your L5, S1 lumbar spine. And the reason that's important is the farther away that center of mass gets from the lumbar spine, the more shear stress you put on your lumbar spine, and that can cause disc issues or just general low back pain. So, and also the total load is going to be lower in a front squat, but effort is going to be the same. And the research says that effort is what really matters when you're talking about motor unit recruitment. So you're going to get the same motor unit recruitment with a front squat to a back squat. Let's say you're doing a 1RM for both. The load is going to obviously be higher in the back squat, but the front squat, you're going to get the exact same strength gains from it. So yeah, I'm not going to do the math right now because frankly, it would take forever. But if you do the math on that and just look at the shear forces on L5S1 and L4, L5, I guess, too, those are going to be significantly higher in a back squat as compared to the front squat. So I always try to front squat when possible. If I get a new team and they've only back squatted, I'm going to try to phase in front squat, but I'll still do a little back squatting with them. So they're getting that stimulus as well. That's about it. What do you think about that?
I mean, I know what you're saying has backing. I don't really have any arguments other than when I try to implement front squats, I will usually have a large portion of my team where the front rack position is so bad that we can't really load it. And I personally don't have people catch cleans, so I don't see the need to fix the front rack in order to get a strength stimulus on the lower body. That
Fair
might
enough.
be a fault of me as a coach, but I've tried to spend a lot of time on it with certain teams, and it will take so much of our training time over the year that I've gone away from anything in a front rack position, in a true like front squat front rack. If you have straps, I don't think there's anything wrong with front squatting with straps. I'm not a fan of that crossed arm because I always see athletes. A back squat that's a properly performed back squat, in my opinion, is safer than someone with the bar jammed into their throat and their arms crossed, trying to balance it like sideways when it's tilting and stuff. But if you spend the time and create a good front rack position and you're able to coach that well and you're able to create that position in a time efficient manner, I do think front squats are better. So I'm not even going to argue with you.
You probably knew everything I said. I was just laying it out for anyone listening.
Yeah. I just personally, like I said, I don't enjoy spending the time trying to get that comfortable or getting them to be able to do it and then getting it comfortable. But yeah.
No, I get it. If I were you, I would just work it into the warm up somehow. So they gotta like just do a couple empty bar, whatever. I mean, however you teach it before they get in your lift. But then I know you're pressed for time. Everybody's pressed for time, so it might not be applicable. But
yeah. I mean,
but I
you're not wrong.
I think it's just worth it at the end of the day to get them there. But it's not for everybody. Every program needs to have context. So those are my thoughts.
Sure. Yeah.
There's something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember. So what have you got?
I don't have any extra thoughts. I think, everyone tests things for different reasons. Everyone uses a very similar testing battery for most of it, but I would say most people probably include something that most others wouldn't include. So just like our last kind of solo podcast, I would be very interested to hear what other people test, why they test, why they wouldn't test what I test, how I can improve what I do. I think there's a lot of tests that are out there that are very, very beneficial that we didn't touch on just because we personally wouldn't have the resources to do. So, like you said, if you have force plates, there's all sorts of things I would do if I had access to that. If you have a 1080 sprint machine, there's all sorts of things I would do with that. The list of tests you can do that would be appropriate and beneficial is virtually endless. So hopefully people that aren't super experienced with this got a good base understanding based on this talk. But like I said, I'd be interested to hear better alternatives or different things that people do that maybe we don't do.
Yeah, for sure. So I remembered what I was going to say. I was just going to say that another reason I use a front squat is because I personally think it's safer when you're going heavy because they can just dump it if you have bumper plates anyway, rather than not very few athletes can dump a bar off their back. I mean, if you have catchers up, that's also a fine substitution, but I just like to dump it personally. But anyway, I agree 100% with what you said. There's plenty of other things out there that you can do. And you and I have always been in similar situations with our technology and resources. So we do similar assessments, but there's certainly a lot of other things out there that people can do. And like Ryan said, anyone watching this, please reach out. We are very happy to discuss with anyone, and we're still looking to learn just as much as everyone else is. So thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time on here.
Yep.